Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to do a What's New in Fusion for September 2025. Now, like with every video we do here, we're not going to cover everything. We'll talk about some of the things I think are probably the best or most important updates. I'll also cover some that I think missed the mark. And as always, you can go to your help menu and what's new. That'll take you directly to the blog post. You can also go to the link of this video. I'll put a hyperlink to the blog post as well. All right, so the first thing that I think is something I've seen probably more comments than anything about is dark mode. So this has actually been in Fusion for over a year now. If you happen to have turned it on when it was a preview feature, you could have continued to use it. If you're on an insider build, you've had access to this as well as it's been evolving and I'm going to say improving. But now for everybody in the general section, you can turn on dark blue, and that's going to give you a dark theme. Now, if this happens to you where you see the background canvas is still white, it probably because in your display settings you have a different environment, like I have Photo Booth. You can go to the theme, which is the default, and that'll do a gray background. You can also change it to another background. So for example, dark sky, if you want it to be a bit darker and more contrast with what you see on the screen here. Now, personally, I like dark theme in some programs and not in others. So for example, I use dark theme in like Microsoft Word, but I still have the paper or the background white. And obviously things like plasticity, I use dark theme for just because that's kind of its default. If I change it, it's much harder to do. Now, I will say that in Fusion and most CAD programs, I am probably in the minority here where I like it to still be a white background and sort of the default gray. But if you want to change it, that's how you do it. Actually, let me go back here. There actually was another update. At the very top of this, there's something called Match Device Theme. So if you're on, let's say, Windows and you've got the entire operating system set up as a dark theme, it can actually inherit that as well. Just keep in mind that your display settings for environment, that will still override that. So if you have Photo Booth or Gray Room or something like that for your background, those will override the default unless you reset it to theme default. So hopefully that makes some people happy. Dark theme is there. The version that was on the insider build, I heard some positives and some negatives about it. Some dialogue options were kind of hidden and grayed out and things like that. But hopefully this public release has gotten better. All right, the next thing I want to talk about has a bit to do with shortcuts. Now, I think that this is in general a good thing, but I think it's probably still slower than the way that I typically do stuff. And I'll talk this through. So let's say that I wanted to use press pull to resize this. Typically what I would do if I were going to use press pull again, let's say on this hole for a different value, is I would use my right click marking menu. Now generally what I do is just drag up and I would select the other hole and then I would resize it. Now in order to do that a little bit slower, I'm going to go ahead and do press pull. Let's make this one bigger, right click, and then if you use the repeat last command, which is at the 12 o'clock position, this automatically okays the dialog, which is this 3 o'clock position, and then it restarts it for you. So this is the quickest way that I know to do this. The update is now the space bar is repeat last command. Now the problem with this is that by default, the dialog is highlighted, which in general is 99% of the time is a great thing because you can just manually enter, let's say, minus 0.125. The problem with this is when you're using this tool, whether it's any dialog, if you hit the space bar, you're erasing that value. So the way to make this work is you have to use the tool in its entirety, either hit OK, enter, or right click and go to OK, and then you have to hit space bar to repeat the command again. So while I think that this is nice that we've now got the spacebar as the repeat last command, I think the right click marking menu is still a little bit faster for me. The other thing to note is it would be really great if zoom window was configurable or had a shortcut key associated with it. That's one thing I don't understand. Like Fit has F6, but also double clicking the mouse wheel will fit to view. But doing the zoom window, the only way you can do that is to go down here to that. And even if you use the S key and you type in zoom, you can add it here. So I could do S key and click zoom to window, but there's no shortcut key as far as I know associated with that. So it would be great if that was tied to a shortcut key more so than the spacebar being repeat last, because the marking menu is still a pretty quick way to do it. So again, that's my own personal opinion, gripe on it, but it's nice that it's there, but I think I'll probably still use that right-click marking menu. Okay, the next thing, parametric text. This is something I think is a great update. So on this connecting rod, which this is part of our CAM course that we're going to be releasing on learneverythingaboutdesign.com, we're going to go through 2-axis, 2.5, 3, and multi-axis. This is part of our 3-axis course. But this 2 horsepower note, this is actually text that we can change in a parameter. So the way that this works is you can create a new parameter, you can set it to text, and the expression will be in single quotes. You can also do this by just simply creating a sketch using the text tool. And inside the text tool, by default, it's now going to be in single quotations. And what this means is by default, it's going to create this parameter that can be configured. Now, you can manually do that. You can enter whatever text you want in those quotes. You can also tie it directly to a parameter that's already created. So this is a great way that we can create configured designs, because parameters in general, and this update to the ability to have text parameters, can be configured. So if you've got variations of a part like this connecting rod where the material changes or the size changes, now you can also configure the text that maybe is the part number or some sort of engraving that happens on that part. So I think that this is actually a really helpful tool, even though it may seem kind of minor. It is really helpful that we can now do that directly in the parameters, and we can add it to configurations. Now, I do want to mention there have been a lot of updates to configurations. We're not going to cover them in this video because we really need to do an update on the configurations content that we have in general. But things like inserting a standard part, we can now configure those on the fly. We can configure new features like this text on the fly, as well as surface thicken and some joint stuff like motion limits and so on. So there are a lot of updates to configurations. If you do use that, I'd suggest going to what's new and taking a look at those. We will be updating configuration content in the near future. I'm not sure if we're going to get to it this month or not, but we will be updating that as well. The next thing I want to talk about is a tool that, I've given my opinion on this, and I'm just going to be honest. I think it's a wasted effort on Autodesk's part for this tool. I don't think it's very useful, but I still think we should cover it. So Auto Constraint is something that exists that in this update, it's supposed to do a better job at finding symmetry. So you can see here, I've got a part, 21.553 millimeters on either side. It is symmetric, and it is able to add that symmetric constraint. Now, the problem here is that if it's not symmetric, and I'm going to zoom way in, and I'm just going to drag this a little bit to the left, and I'm going to go back to Auto Constraint. All right, so now it's 21.549 and 21.555. It no longer has the ability to add that constraint. And I can generate more and just keep going, keep generating. It never adds a symmetry constraint. So this is where I really think that this tool just kind of falls short, because if you create a sketch that is a loose approximation of your design, then you really have to go back and manually add dimensions and constraints to make it work. If you are getting something that is already perfectly close, so for example, if I add a midpoint constraint between those two, then there's no need for a symmetry constraint, because these are driven as symmetric because this line is vertical, perpendicular to the top and bottom, and it's at the midpoint top and bottom. So in this case, the only thing that we're getting out of this is a couple of dimensions. And those are generally easy enough for us just to do on our own, because we also have to modify them. So this would likely be 40 millimeters, and this would be maybe 25, and this would be, let's say, 90. Okay, so I don't really see a big benefit to this, because in reality, I don't see it saving any time unless you're bringing a sketch from another system. Let's say you have a DXF that was exported from AutoCAD, and you wanted to automatically add all these dimensions and constraints. If it's already spot on, then yeah, maybe it could do it. But in most cases, designing something new in Fusion, I don't see a benefit to this tool to the point where I would use it over doing it manually. So again, that's just my own personal opinion. You can kind of chime in and determine what you want to do with it as well. But I think that the effort could go to other things. Now, there's probably a good chance that this tool has got some downstream goal that is not realized here for what we're doing. But for the way it exists right now, I don't ever use it. I don't see a good reason to use it over doing it manually and having your own design intent. The next thing that I want to talk about is going to be in sheet metal and also surfacing. So we've got a couple of minor updates here. The Thicken tool now has the ability to do a rounded thicken. So this option allows us to take a square corner, and when it's external, it'll add a fillet to it that is equal to the thickness of our part. Now, this is something that we saw in the shell tool. This was added a little while ago where we have the rounded shell option. So instead of maintaining those square corners, the shell has the ability to basically round the corners off, similar to what the surface tool now does. So I think it's a nice option. It doesn't really, I mean, this just keeps you from having to manually go back and add a fillet there. So it is nice to have that ability, especially if you're designing the inside face of a part and you want to thicken it outward. So that's a nice option to have. Again, it's a fairly minor update, but it's something that could be helpful in your design. The next update to sheet metal is not new functionality, but they broke out the lofted flange into its own button, and that's basically the majority of it. It has its own tooltip now. And there's some tooltips in the dialog, for example. But in reality, the way that this tool worked before is that you picked the standard flange and then you had to pick the lofted flange if that's what you wanted to do. Those options are still available, so you can still go back and forth between the standard flange or the lofted flange. And you have a lofted flange icon that appears in the timeline. So again, there's not really any functionality update to it because it's still something that you could have done before, but you just have to go back and pick one or the other. Let me go ahead and hide that body. Right, so you just had to pick one or the other before. You can still do that the same. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what happened with the pattern tools. So in the past, you used to have to pick the pattern you wanted, and now they're all combined into the same dialog. It just happened to go the reverse direction with lofted flange. Before, you had to pick the one tool and then toggle between them, but now each has their own button, but they can still be toggled between in that dialog. So again, no new functionality that I'm aware of, but you do have the ability to click on the lofted flange, and it does have its own icon in the timeline, so that can be helpful. The next thing is, again, something I have mixed feelings on, Insert Fastener. So Insert Fastener always gets updates with every update to Fusion. Essentially, the bulk of it is that more hardware gets added over and over again. What has changed this time is actually the ability for us to configure hardware. And what I mean by this is that in general, this is probably not going to work because there's an orange bar here. But in general, what we now have is the ability to go into things like the nominal length. And at the bottom, you should see an option to add your own length. And then once you do that, it gives you the ability to go in and basically add it to your library. It doesn't appear to be working right now for whatever reason. It worked earlier when I tested it, and it's not working now. I don't know why. Maybe it's something to do with this file. But it does give you the ability to basically add or create a custom variation of hardware. You do still need to be careful that it is something that you can really get access to. I personally, because I do consulting projects for clients, I still generally insert from McMaster-Carr just as my own rule, because the designs that I make, they're generally wrapped up into a sort of a single bundle, and the client can look at the McMaster number and they can order hardware from them if they want, or they can use the specs and decide they want to order something else. Whereas if I use Insert Fastener, I still have to track down a vendor for that hardware. And it just in my case, it doesn't make sense. So I generally don't use insert fastener if it's something that is going to be manufactured. Now, if it's something I just need to add hardware to, and I just need a representation of the hardware, I can go to that and I can use it. But again, in general, the tool doesn't work for me for my use cases. But hopefully that helps some users being able to basically customize those. Now, if they ever get to the point where you can build out a fastener library with manufacturer hardware that has the manufacturer part number and specs and data with it, then I think it will really take that next step and become a super useful tool. Right now, it's still kind of a mixed bag depending on the company you work for. Or if you're a consultant doing work for a client, then it kind of depends on how that interaction works. All right, another update that I do want to talk about is something that I think is really helpful and it's trending the right direction, but there's still some potential problems here. So the Save As dialog, I do want to make a note here that there are changes coming to hubs and things like you may see in a lot of the notes CE, a collaborative environment. So if you are on a hub that was created before March of this year, then it's going to look like mine looks here. If you're a brand new Fusion user that is on a commercial license and you've created your account after April, then you will start to see some different functionality. Things like saves and milestones are different in the newer hubs. It's basically there's no save dialog that pops up. You have to go in and then history is what would typically be our versions, and then creating a version would be a milestone. So there's some nuanced differences there. But with that, Save As now has an include drawings option, which is nice because you can save your assembly and all associated drawings and take all that and sort of bundle it up without having to export it. So typically what we would have to do in the past is export, and what would happen is we would create an F3Z file, and the F3Z file theoretically would bring external designs, but historically it hadn't brought the drawings with it. So the only way to get around that was to create a share link to a drawing, then download that share link, and then re-upload that F3Z file, which would contain the drawing, which is an F2Z file, the 3D designs, the internal ones, which are F3D, and the external ones, which end up coming in as an F3Z file. And it's confusing, I know. But the problem here is that if you tend to use a derive workflow, so what I mean by that is, in this case, for, let's say, a larger assembly, and I want to create a manufacturer version of a part. Let's say it's cast, or let's say I just need to add fixtures and design a soft jaw to hold this part. Then I would typically derive it into its own file. So that way I'm not bringing in external vices and soft jaws and things like that into a main assembly. This way I've got a single design. It's linked back to the original. And then I can continue to work on it and defeature it or do whatever I need to do to build out the toolpaths in the manufacturer workspace. The problem with this is that derives are still one of those things that sometimes gets forgotten in bundling up these designs. So the Save As doesn't seem, at least at this point, doesn't seem to bring derives with it. So you could potentially be losing that data. There is also the problem that if you do a Save As on a derive, the actual Save As version of that will still be linked back to the original assembly. So unfortunately, this is one of those things that Fusion does great, and that's offering us flexibility in how we decide to design and work with these designs. And in that, they've kind of created this situation where it can sometimes be hard to bundle up that data. There's not really a like pack and go like you would have with Inventor, for example, but it's easy to invite people to the projects and collaborate and so on. So it's kind of one of those problems that it only shows up very rarely, depending on what you're doing with your data sets. But it is still a problem that I feel like we need to highlight and mention. So I'm happy that we can do Save As and include those drawings. I still think that there's a little bit of work that needs to be done to figure out how to keep all of those links together with a Save As, anything that's been derived out of a file, and those links. It is all apparent if you go into your data panel and you take a look at the design. So for example, if we expand this, we can see that it uses an external reference vise. It's used in. These are setup sheets for the two setups to machine this part. And then it also has two derives that are linked to it. This derive to is a save as. And again, these are both designs that are still linked back to the original, even though a save as was done. So hopefully that gets a little bit more attention. I know that the team at Fusion is working on a lot in the back end about file management and metadata and all that kind of stuff that I can't really mention right now, but hopefully that kind of gets wrapped up and sorted out. Okay, so a couple of other things I do want to mention are related to performance. So performance-wise, every update of Fusion always says, increased performance switching between designs. It's 50% faster or 22% faster opening up a new design. I don't really have any way to quantify that, unfortunately. But I will say that in general, since the What's New updates have mentioned having a performance boost, I've actually noticed quite the opposite. And I don't know if it's because this system's on Windows 10. I don't know if it has to do with hardware or what the case is. But in general, every time I see a performance boost or a performance boost mentioned, I have not realized that on my system. One place that's not true is actually in the manufacturer workspace. I need to update all these toolpaths because I monkeyed around with the file a bit. But one thing that has updated this version is the ability to do toolpath simulations with the GPU. This is, I think, amazing. This changes the amount of time that we have to spend simulating toolpaths by a huge amount. This is a fairly simple part. It does have some 3D toolpaths. So for example, we've got a 3D scallop here that has a lot of passes, even for a relatively small part. And what we can see if we go in and simulate this is there's now an option in the simulation workspace called Simulate Faster using GPU. If I play through this, it's able to simulate the stock removal, and I'm not even going as fast as it can go, within a couple of seconds. That alone would take a minute or two easy on this small part to simulate that scallop toolpath. So that alone has saved a ton of time in the simulation, and I think that is a wonderful update to Fusion. The last thing I really want to mention is something called the desktop connector. Now, probably most people don't use this, but if you go into your file, I'm on a Windows machine, but if you go into your file system, there is going to be under your PC a section called Fusion 360, even though Autodesk officially changed the name to Fusion and dropped the 360 off of it. But this is basically allowing you to go into your projects, your subfolders, and you can open up designs directly from here. So for example, this is a GoPro tree mount I made for doing mountain biking filming. And we didn't do a video on this, but basically I can go through, I can navigate to that location, I can find it, and I can open it from my Windows File Explorer. Now, of course, you can go to the Home tab. You can also go into your data panel, for example, and you can figure out which way works best for you. For me, the data panel is still my go-to. I very rarely use the Home tab for a couple of different reasons, mainly because I like to drag and drop files into my assemblies, and I can't really do that from the Home tab. And if we go back to the design workspace, using the option to insert a part, actually it's in the assemble insert component, this doesn't give me the ability to see a thumbnail preview of it like we have if we go into the data panel. So I still prefer the data panel over the Home tab or over the option to insert a component. That's my own personal preference. So that's it for the updates. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on the video. If there's something we missed that you wanted to see, let me know about that. And if you have any experience with any of these updates, positive or negative, go ahead and leave those comments as well. That way we can get some feedback, collaborate, and figure out, if they're working well for some people and not for others, or if they're bad for everybody or good for everybody. That's always helpful knowledge. That way, if somebody's struggling a bit with a new feature or something, they understand if they're alone in that case or if everybody's dealing with the same thing. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.